We're continuing our discussion of the concept of ordinary psychosis, and in order to do so, we'll need to just add a few definitions of some crucial concepts. One of those is the name of the father, an oft-repeated, often quite well-known Lacanian concept, but I think it's quite helpful just to pin it to a definition or an example of sorts. So we'll speak about that. We'll also briefly introduce some of the Lacanian critiques of the notion of borderline personality disorder. This will be important because you could say that, in some respects at least, the whole notion of ordinary psychosis is a response to not only the advent of borderline personality disorder as a prominent diagnostic category, but also as a response to the gradual minimization or avoidance or perhaps exclusion of the very idea of mild psychosis. So those are 2 points of focus. Then we will also be returning to Jacques-Alain Millet's paper, Ordinary Psychosis Revisited, just to get a sense of how he develops that argument and what else is important there. So as a way of introduction, we'll refer again to Jonathan Redmond's Ordinary Psychosis in the Body, just to give us some definitional terms. These will sound familiar to what I've said before, but let's just reiterate 2 of them. On page 26, towards the end of his first chapter, he reminds us that ordinary psychosis comprises a wide range of subtle and mild psychotic phenomena irreducible to the presence of positive symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. Interestingly, that was a quote, a wide range of subtle and mild psychotic phenomena. A range of different phenomena. He goes on to say, cases of ordinary psychosis are still organized by the idea of symbolic foreclosure. Jacques-Alain Millet's emphasis is instead on the mechanisms of stabilization. I mention that just to note that when we're talking about ordinary psychosis, we're still talking about the notion of foreclosure, which is very important in Lacanian theories of psychosis. We are still prioritizing the notion of symbolic foreclosure, even though now the emphasis is very much on mechanisms of stabilization. So, to put that in slightly different words, when there has been a type of foreclosure, typically a foreclosure of the name of the father, we'll say what that is in a few moments, there needs to be some kind of response to that, because if the name of the father is not operating as a principle, as a function, then that can throw one's world into disarray. So there will always be a kind of compensatory response, with the exception of something like catatonia. We had a nice quote from Jacques-Alain Millet. In fact, I'll give you that quote just to build on the point that Redmond is saying. Here's Jacques-Alain Millet. In psychosis, if it's not complete catatonia, you always have something that enables the subject to get away or to continue to survive. And in some way, the make-believe father is no better than this. It's a well-fitting make-believe. So basically, in many instances, we would say that the name of the father is what operates in neurosis. But even if that's not operating, if it has indeed been foreclosed, there's different substitutes, or what Jacques-Alain Millet will go on to talk about, compensatory make-believe substitutes. Something that does something like the work of the name of the father. Now, for those of us who are familiar with Lacan's ideas about psychosis, we may already hear an echo here of the idea that in the absence of the paternal metaphor, which is something that we find, the name of the father, where the name of the father comes to stand in for the vexing question of the desire of the mother, when the name of the father doesn't operate, then you might have a failure of the paternal metaphor. And in certain instances of psychosis, the response to that would be the advent of a delusional metaphor. And we don't need to go there to flesh all of that out just yet, but just to say that there's an echo of this idea in this current notion that when there isn't a name of the father or a not functioning name of the father, there can be some other compensatory mechanism. So we'll speak a little bit about that, but I just wanted to stress this idea that a supplementary device is essential to understanding how stabilization in psychosis occurs. Because, I'm quoting Redmond, because an ordinary psychosis does not constitute a separate clinical structure and therefore must be conceptualized using the foreclosure of the name of the father. So in this respect, we could say that the notion of ordinary psychosis is not iconoclastic. It's not reinventing something. It fits actually in with many classical Lacanian formulations of psychosis. Just to reiterate, it must be conceptualized using the foreclosure of the name of the father. So that means, in an interesting way then, that it's not that we're kind of knocking something down and rebuilding something, but this in a sense is an expansion of the theory of psychosis. I'll give 2 more points from Redmond before we return to Jacques-Alain Millet, and we'll look at some quotes from Stijn Vanheule. But just let's note a couple of points that Redmond makes in the conclusion of his first chapter in the book Ordinary Psychosis in the Body. He says, in this chapter, I've argued that ordinary psychosis provides a general theory of psychosis and does not constitute a new nosological entity. It's not a new diagnostic notion. Rather, ordinary psychosis preserves the neurosis-psychosis distinction, the binary that we spoke about before, and it focuses on positing mechanisms of stabilization that operate in mild psychosis. So once again, the emphasis on mechanisms of stabilization. Rather than a constant reiteration of deficit of things that aren't working, we are trying here to focus much more, an indication of the focus in Lacan's much later work on psychosis, on how stabilization is indeed working. And just to reiterate once again, in any instance of psychosis, there is already an attempt to respond to the crisis of the triggering or the onset of psychosis, but it varies in multiple different ways. And of course, you could say some instances are more successful than others. He also notes that, and here's a nice new point to introduce, ordinary psychosis provides an important alternative to the borderline concept, a diagnosis that provides a midpoint between psychosis and neurosis based on symptom severity. So there you hear it. It's the first part of an argument that he will go on to advance. Ordinary psychosis is an alternative to the notion of borderline. And we'll say a little bit more about why the notion of borderline is unsatisfactory to Lacanians. Let's just continue this quote, though. I've offered a critique of the borderline concept, focused on the problematic assumptions underlying symptom severity, and I've showed, this is Redmond, how the midpoint between neurosis and psychosis marginalizes the notion of mild psychosis in contemporary psychiatry and psychoanalytic theory. So I've alluded to that once before, but one of Redmond's concerns, and you could say one of Jacques-Alain Millet's concerns, is the fact that mild forms of psychosis are now being sidelined, are not being seen, are not being registered as such, because now we have this concept of borderline. And the argument is that that does a less adequate job. So we've given a little premonition of an argument to come about borderline, but we've also seen how, in a very important way, the notion of ordinary psychosis actually is a general theory of psychosis. So rather than a kind of splintering off, you could say that you could essentially say that it expands upon the notion of psychosis as it is already being developed or has historically been developed by Lacan. So I wanted to stress that point. But now let's quickly ask ourselves, what is this thing that keeps on being spoken about when we talk about the foreclosure of the name of the father? What is the name of the father? Well, I've got some other videos where I try and describe this concept, but for today, let us make reference to another important paper. It's a book chapter by Stijn Vanheule. It's simply called On Ordinary Psychosis, and it's included in this book, Lacan, on psychosis. Vanheule's chapter tracks quite closely the arguments that Jacques-Alain Millet makes in Ordinary Psychosis Revisited, and he highlights a series of points. But at the beginning of his chapter, he reminds us about the basics of psychotic structure in Lacanian theory. And he gives us a little blow-by-blow account, which I think is useful just to create a sense of what is this notion of the name of the father. So he's referring to 1959 Lacan's paper on a question prior to any possible treatment of psychosis, which we'll be referring to shortly later as well. And he suggests there that all subjectivity rests on a lack of being, or a want to be, a manque à être. Everyone's going to laugh and complain that my French pronunciation is hopeless, so go ahead, do it, just laugh. But this sense that in Lacanian theory, what is the basis of subjectivity is a fundamental lack of being. It's lack subjectify. There's lack which is at the very basis of human subjectivity, a lack which, back to Vanheule, gives rise to self-directed epistemic questions. Who am I? What am I? What am I to you? These questions concern the intentionality of another. So it's not just what am I or what should I be. Those questions seem to always implicitly always involve who am I to you? What must I be for you? In the case of neurosis, the question pertaining to the intentionality of the other is addressed in terms of a lawful principle. A lawful principle which is presumed at the basis of another's actions. In other words, this lawful principle, which Vanheule calls the name of the Father, is a way of creating some stability, a way of getting a sense of who I am to you, of what the world seems to mean from your standpoint, and it enables me to anchor, to locate, to situate myself, to take on a speaking position, to take on a position from which questions of desire, questions of vexing, questions of what this other person is doing in the situation might be answered. Let's go back to Vanheule's description. In the clinical structure of neurosis, the subject takes shape starting from the belief that the other's actions are not simply random, but are guided by meaningful principles. Social and cultural laws determine what the other does or should do. Lacan calls this lawful principle the name of the Father. When I've tried to describe this before in some of my other lectures, I've said that the name of the Father is a kind of conduit to cultural norms and social understandings and values. What I mean by that is that once the name of the Father is, as it were, installed, it means that you've got a good radar. You've got a good radar for how things seem to work in this situation, for what might be the desire of people around me, for how I might locate myself. That's one way we've tried to describe it before. I have a kind of roots, and the name of the Father here also would locate me, not just within a family structure, but within a position that means I have an identity in relationship to other people around me. In other words, I'm located in a social network. Let's go back to Vanheule. A name of the Father, in Psychosis, by contrast, this name of the Father, this lawful principle, as he puts it, or for me, this conduit that locates me within social norms and values and signifiers and understanding and language and the social order, this is missing. This name of the Father is radically missing in Psychosis. It is foreclosed. A name of the Father or a master signifier is a signifier that is taken for granted and a means by which the subject can manifest itself at the moment one is presumed to take on a position in relationship to the other, or in relationship to questions related to existence that make up the unconscious. Let's put it very basically. In a situation, if you're in an anxiety-provoking situation, you're suddenly called upon to speak in front of a court of law, and someone says to you, who are you, what is your position, and tell me something significant about your existence, where you want to go, what you want to do. This is a bit of an anxiety-provoking situation. Most of those things you don't have to think about. But in certain situations like that, when one is called upon to speak and to give a basis for one's role and ability to speak and present something about oneself, that can be a little bit difficult. The idea here is that if one is neurotic, you've got something to rely on. You've got the name of the Father, the speaking position, the location, the kind of almost intuitive, in the sense of installed set of social values, norms, and so on, which would give you a speaking response. It would give you both a sense of what are the social values, norms, signifiers that are significant in this situation, what people might be desiring. You won't have a definitive answer, but you'd have a good working presumption. And it also gives you a kind of speaking positionality to be able to say those things in moments when your symbolic and social subjectivity is called into question. That's not saying it wouldn't be anxiety-provoking, but you can try and speak and say something to represent yourself. You could argue, though, that for certain subjects, this is not just an anxiety-provoking situation. It's one where an answer does not present itself. It's one that a hole can open up, a gap can open up, where something like confusion or inability to respond will emerge. Vanheule goes on to say that it's not the simple Father that does it. It is the presumption that there is a representative of sorts that confers a speaking position. So he gives an example. A name of the father is a signifier in the name of which one speaks and takes on a position in relationship to others. For example, imagine a father with a young toddler, and at times the child says nasty things. I won't read them. At this point, the father might intervene and tell his son to behave. Yet, of course, typically, toddlers don't obey when one says this, which might bring the father to say something like, "You have to stop doing this because daddy says so." In this example, the signifier daddy is a name of the father. It is a signifier in the name of which the parent positions themselves and guides the child. So, nice example. Let's add one further element to Vanheule's description. What is characteristic of psychosis is that at specific events in a life, which typically involve others, the subject fails to get constituted by means of a master signifier or name of the father to represent him or herself in relationship to these questions pertaining to existence. The net result of such a confrontation is that one no longer experiences continuity at the level of mental life. The subject collapses, and experience of crisis accompanied by intrusive symptoms comes to the fore. I think that's a really nice description. I was trying to get at it. He does a better job. I'll just read that last point. The subject fails to get constituted by means of a master signifier or name of the father. You could say, to be a little bit silly, the daddy function in the example that he gave doesn't work, that the subject isn't constituted in relationship to a name of the father, a master signifier of sorts. They're unable as such to represent themselves in relationships to questions pertaining to existence. And I like Vanheule's emphasis on existence here, because existence opens up into a more kind of existential domain whereby all of us at some level need to respond to the questions of where do I come from, what is valuable in me, what should my life be about, what matters a great deal to me, whom would I be with, what is the answer to the enigmas of sexuality, to procreation, to questions of death. All of these questions are, in a sense, you could say, as existentialism might tell us, pretty impossible to answer. Maybe they're impossible at some level, but you can summon up some kind of response. So let me correct that. They're not impossible to provide an answer to. They might seem rather impossible to provide the ultimate, final, exemplary, perfected, totalizing answer to, but we are able to try and do our best to provide some answer to. Although in some cases, that's not working very well. Let's stress again that last sentence. The net result of such a confrontation, when one is called upon to respond to the enigmas, the questions of one's existence, and one is not able to, the net result of such a confrontation is that one no longer experiences continuity at the level of mental life. A very good way of putting it. One no longer experiences continuity at the level of mental life. Little gaps open up. Things don't make consistent sense. The fabric of social and psychical reality doesn't seem to be operating. The subject collapses, and an experience of crisis accompanied by intrusive symptoms comes to the fore. So let's just highlight one more thing, and then we'll draw to a close for this second lecture. What Vanheule is saying is not only do we have a kind of absence or an inability to provide meaningful responses, it's not just that words fail, so to speak. They fail, I guess, pretty much for everybody, but they fail more dramatically here. It's not just that an attempt to position oneself in relationship to signifiers and words and symbolic meaning and symbolic relationships and positions and positionality and authority doesn't work. That's a big enough crisis as it is, you could say. But it's also that is accompanied by invasive forms of jouissance. So let me just see if I can find one more quote. Just across the next page, page 80. When are psychotic crises triggered? It will be when an appeal to position oneself via the signifier, let's say via language, via the symbolic order, is made, but no support is found in any signifier, in any words, in any concepts, in any ideas. And this interrupts the signifying chain, or the train of thoughts that make up our existence of reality. There isn't an adequate response, and that disrupts the consistency of our psychical life. Lacan's structural idea concerning psychosis implies the hypothesis that foreclosure pertaining to questions related to existence determines the outbreak of specific psychotic phenomena. The non-articulation of the subject confronts the individual with a strange jouissance that emanates from the body and or the other, and with no sense that can be made of them. So not only is there a breakdown of sense, but there is an emanation of a kind of strange, difficult to compute, difficult to make sense of jouissance. Okay, so we will pick up again at that point. We've tried to give a little bit of we've gone back to some more classical notions of what is psychosis. Hopefully this will fit with the description of ordinary psychosis that we're going on to develop. And what we will want to say a little bit in the following lecture, a little bit more on, is both how we would think the relation of neurosis psychosis and ordinary psychosis, bearing in mind that you could say that ordinary psychosis is a kind of expansion of the notion of psychosis. We'll want to say a little bit more about that, and then also foreground a couple of points that Redman makes, which wants to suggest that ordinary psychosis is both a response to the popularity of BPD, the borderline concept and borderline personality disorder, and also to say why why from a Lacanian position this diagnostic category, which is so popular in our current era, has limitations and has problems. Let's stop here.